Now for today's program. Alex Bruner, a former international management consultant and fundraiser, has a special interest in the history of the Jewish people and lectures on Israel, the Middle East, and anti Semitism. A child of Holocaust survivors from Yugoslavia who remained in Europe after World War II, Alex was instrumental in resurrecting his uncle's Holocaust memoir, Cold Crematorium, Reporting from the Land of Auschwitz, which was published for the first time in English in January 2024. Susan Suleiman was born in Budapest and emigrated to the United States as a child with her parents. She had a long and distinguished career as a professor of French and comparative literature at Harvard University and has won many honors. She has published more than a dozen books and over 100 articles in international journals, as well as book reviews in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and Moment magazine, among others. She is the author of her acclaimed memoirs, Budapest Diary, In Search of the Mother Book, and Daughter of History, Traces of an Immigrant Girlhood. Joining Alex and Susan today is Amy E. Schwartz, Moment Magazine's book and opinion editor, as well as editor of the magazine's Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Alex Bruner, Susan Suleiman, and Amy E. Schwartz.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. And thanks so much to Alex for bringing us this ghastly, horrible, wonderful book, and to Susan for joining us to talk about it. So let's start with today's date, or rather yesterday's date. Yesterday was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and also the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet troops. It's complicated. People remember different aspects of the Holocaust on different dates, but that's the one that's probably people are aware of at the moment. So all these years later, we might have thought that the memory of the Holocaust had pretty much taken shape, if not its final form, then at least something recognizable. We have the classic accounts, including by Moment's co-founder Elie Wiesel, of course, and Frank and Primo Levi and all those people. And we have mountains of research, too many researchers to name, about the details. You'd think we knew everything that we were ever going to know firsthand about the camps, but then along comes this book, Cold Crematorium, Reporting from the Land of Auschwitz. It was published in English last year. It got a huge response. It was named one of the 10 most notable books of 2024. So let me start by asking you, Alex, you're responsible for this amazing phenomenon. How did this book come to be published in English? How did it come to be? And sort of not only how, but why? Can you tell us the story?
Sure. So my uncle, Jozsef Debreczeni, wrote the book in his native language, which was Hungarian, in 1950. And for decades, it was not available in a world language, primarily because...
Yeah, tell us about what your... Yeah. This must have been shortly after he was liberated from Auschwitz.
Yeah, he was liberated from a camp in Poland, not from Auschwitz, like many of the Hungarian Jews who were deported in the spring of 1944. He was sent to Auschwitz. He went through what was called selection, and he was, quote unquote, one of the lucky ones. He was sent to a number of different slave labor camps. And in the last one, he was near death when he was liberated by the Red Army in the first week of May 1945. After liberation, he moved to Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And after recovering, he returned to his literary career. He was a very successful writer, author, poet, and journalist prior to World War II. He returned to that career. And his seminal work was definitely Cold Crematorium, which narrates this horrific journey from the former Yugoslavia to Auschwitz, to the camps in Poland, and finally liberation. It was written in Hungarian, but it was published not in Hungary, it was published in Yugoslavia. there were political reasons why it was not published in Eastern Europe, also political reasons why it was not published in the West. And it was really not available to a world audience until 2024, when Macmillan and Penguin Random House simultaneously released the book in English. And since then, it has been translated and published in 16 other languages, and we have 4 more languages to go.
This did not descend miraculously on this book from heaven, right? You as his nephew were the moving force. Can you explain how this
Yes,
came to
yes, yes, absolutely. So Jozsef Debreczeni was his pen name, his nom de plume. He was a Bruner. He was born Bruner. He was my father's elder brother. He took on Debreczeni as a young man. And of course, I knew about the book as a very young child. And in the beginning, of course, I didn't understand the significance. But what I did notice always was the reverence that my parents and others would handle this relatively small book that was in our bookcase. And that always stayed with me, of course, as I grew up. I understood what an important document this was about our own family history, but also for the history of the Holocaust.
Had you read it? When did you first read it? Do you know how old you were?
I read it as a teenager. But I really only dedicated myself to the book, to getting it to a worldwide audience when, when I retired a few years ago. I noticed that, first of all, the obvious thing was that there were many fewer survivors. People didn't seem to know much about the Holocaust. And I could see both Holocaust denial and especially Holocaust distortion growing.
Where were you at this point?
Well, at this point, I was in Boca Raton, Florida, which is where I've lived for 25 years. It was after my retirement. But I observed this over a number of decades, and I saw how the Holocaust was being distorted both by the extreme left and the extreme right. And that was a great concern for me. So I embarked on getting the book out to the world. I wanted really a publisher that had the capabilities to bring it to a broad audience. I was not looking to self-publish. I was not looking for a small academic journal. In all of these things, there is an element of luck. I went through a very rigorous process of getting a top-notch translator. The translator in some ways is sort of the co-author of the book. And I was very lucky, and I worked with Paul Schwartz. I was also very lucky to get a fabulous agent, a Liebman agency in Zurich. And they brought the book out at the Frankfurt Book Fair in November of 2022. And the book was an immediate success.
This was the first translation was in English?
Well, there was a translation into Serbo-Croatian.
No, I mean on this occasion when you brought it out in Frankfurt.
It was only in English.
You're betting on and by this time your uncle had been many years dead, right?
Jozsi died in 1978. Mm-hmm. He was 73 years old.
So go on anyway. So it was
he was born in Austria-Hungary in 1905. So his life really straddled an important part of modern European history.
Mm-hmm. And that's his picture behind you, right? Let's take this moment to show the picture.
That's a charcoal painting of my uncle. And this is a picture of the two of us. Of course, I'm a little younger. Yes, we had a nice close relationship.
And so after the English translation, it's all just happened as you had hoped, right? Pretty much as you might have your wildest hopes.
No, this is way beyond my wildest hopes. publishers. I was pretty sure that I would get a publisher, but not that I would get two of the five, major publishing English publishing empires to do it. So I'm very pleased. I'm very proud. My only regret, of course, is that my uncle and my father, who tried unsuccessfully to get American publishers. He was a Yugoslavian diplomat. He was stationed in Washington in the early 50s. He tried very hard to get American publishers to translate it into English and publish the work. He was rebuffed at every point. And the reason was that this was the era of McCarthyism, the Rosenberg trials, and people didn't want to touch anything that put the Soviets in a favorable light. My father always said what did it in was the last scene where the prisoners in the last camp leave and they're singing the Internationale, which is a communist anthem.
Right. And that does ring funny to the Western reader, but we'll come back later to the politics of this, but because it's very interesting how the Cold War complicated all these memory issues. But for now, let me segue to Susan, because I will start by saying, obviously as a book review editor, I constantly seeing galleys across my desk of this undiscovered memoir and that undiscovered memoir, and sometimes they're as told to, and sometimes they're, lost diaries or something. And they're mostly just not that effective, and they mostly, disappear without a trace. Why was this one different? Susan, you reviewed this book for the Washington Post book review, and maybe tell us what's special about this account.
Well, yeah, I had the same question when I was sent the book, to review. Okay, is this? I mean, I had already heard good things, sort of, but I was wondering what is special about this book. So, well, I would say several things. First of all, there is an element of novelty in what he reports, because as Alex mentioned, he was taken to Auschwitz, but then he was sent to what are called sort of satellite camps, not far from Auschwitz. And he talks about three of them, and the last one was totally novel to me because it was basically a kind of a dumping ground. I mean, it's almost the word he uses, that where the Nazis late in the war, very late, like around November, December 1944, by then a lot of the crematoria were not working. They were dismantling them in Auschwitz because the Soviets were on the way. They didn't want to leave too many traces. So this Dornhau, where he spent 6 months, Jozsef, from November 44 to his liberation in May 45, was basically a kind of a dying ground, because by the time many people were sent there, they were half dead. He himself, actually, it should be said, was not yet half dead, but he was fairly, he had chosen to go there for one of his other camps. Who knows, these choices people have. But so he gets there, and basically he lies there naked on his bunk for months. So this whole thing, that there's this camp called Dernhau where the Nazis sent people to die, and is what gives the novel. I say, well, it's like a novel because it's so good, but it's true. But what gives the book its title, because the inmates called it the cold crematorium. That is, instead of being gassed and burned, you could just die in the cold. And there's a wonderful sentence that he has, which is, I was burning in the cold crematorium, or I am burning in the cold crematorium, which is a really strange image, right? But that's what it is. They didn't have to burn the bodies or gas the people. They could just let them die. So that's one thing. I mean, I learned something, but I think the real, important reasons why I think the book is really admirable and new in its own way is the way he tells the whole story. I mean, he was as Alex mentioned, he was a writer, he was a poet, he was also a journalist. So he could observe, a trained observer. He really analyzed a lot of things. about what was happening to him. And one of the things that he harps on in just about every place where he finds himself is the hierarchy. That is, that there is and he analyzes this, the camp hierarchy. That is, even among the inmates, there was a hierarchy. There was the so-called camp, the camp Altester, the old one of the camp, the main. He was not a Nazi. He was an inmate, but he had a lot of power. And then under him, all the way down to capos, which we've heard of. Capos were the people in charge of a specific barrack or a detail, a work detail. And what Debreczeni notices is, of course, and this is the incredible thing, is he says, some were decent and some were brutes. So, like, why is it that even among the inmates, some people behaved ferociously, viciously toward the other prisoners? And he has this incredible sort of observation that the Nazis were diabolical because they understood that the fiercest slave driver is a slave with privileges. So what they did was they gave these people in charge, the capos and all the way up, privileges. They had better food, they had better places to sleep, whatever. And so they could count on them turning into horrible people. And what Debreczeni does is he shows us a whole slew of portraits of this hierarchy, showing that some were horrible and some were not. And so the question is, why is it that some people in really extreme circumstances turn into beasts while others don't? He never answers that question, but he makes us ask it, so I think that the writing, these portraits are really extraordinary. And I'll give you one example in a minute, but the writing, is really not just a personal testimony, but a philosophical reflection on what it means to be human, what it means to be a human being. And Primo Levi, whom you mentioned, also has that. His book was called "If This Is a Man." So what is it to be human? I mean, all the great literary memoirs or testimonies have that philosophical aspect. So, but just to give you one example of this, the way he writes is he writes about the Nazis, the same thing, incidentally. The Nazis were mainly brutes, but occasionally one guard behaved well. He would drop a cigarette that he had just lit so that the inmates could pick it up. He did it on purpose. So it was a whole cigarette, which was like worth, I don't know, a half a ration of bread or whatever, or 2 rations of bread, because they were dying for cigarettes. So, but the thing that really got to me was an incident he recounts where another Nazi, a captain, arrives to inspect a work detail. He's from outside the camp, and people have a kind of horror of him. They know what he's like, and he shows up and he asks the capo in the work detail, "Who is your best worker?" And the guy very proudly says, "Oh, it's this young man here, number 144587 or whatever," because they had numbers, not names. That's one way of dehumanizing people. And so we expect him to sort of praise this young man. He's happy. The man is proud. What does he do? He takes out his revolver, puts it to the temple of the prisoner, and shoots. So the man immediately dies. And then he says that the captain says, "A little demonstration that even the best Jew must croak." When there's one example of the writing that Debreczeni produces in this book, and I think it's very effective.
Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, so Susan made many good points. I'd like to follow up on a few. So you may wonder, how did Jozsef survive? And it's related to this, what was the cold crematorium. So what happened in the last few months of the war, literally the last few months, the Nazis, the local people, the Nazi commanders knew they were losing the war. It was obvious. And Hitler, of course, wanted to get rid of the last Jew in the world, even if it meant losing the actual physical war. But the local commanders started thinking that maybe they would be held personally accountable for the crimes in the camps. Now, we know that never happened. The vast majority of them got away scot-free, but they thought they may be charged. And so rather than sending the prisoners who were too weak to work directly to the gas chambers, they sent them to these so-called prison hospitals, of which Dornhau was one. This is the one that Jozsef went to. And to speed up the death process, they would cut their rations, they would take away their clothes, they would cut the heat, and they would even introduce typhus by bringing in infected prisoners from other camps. So I think that's one important thing. And I did want to comment about this idea of humanity and how humanity is tested. And I think there is a huge difference between the prisoners and the Germans. So the prisoners, absolutely, Jozsef hated the capos. He devoted a lot of time explaining what a incredibly nefarious system the Nazis had come up with. But you have to understand that hunger drove everything. This is hunger that you cannot imagine. This is hunger where every cell in your body is demanding calories. You know, we get about 1,800 calories. They worked 14 hours a day. They got 600 calories a day. So what happened, and Jozsef describes this, a father and a son would fight over a morsel of bread. So when you bring people down to that level, anything can happen. The German guards were different. And Jozsef is very clear. He said the one person that Susan mentioned who would drop the cigarette butts, he was the one guard, the only one who showed humanity, that he understood these prisoners were humans. And one of the interesting things I learned from a new book called by Tobias Buck is that no SS officer or guard in any of the camps who wanted to leave would be punished. In other words, anybody, and there were many cases where people, you know, the guards, the real guards, asked to be reassigned, and there was no penalty. So these people wanted to be there. Very different, you know, choices that the capos and the prisoners had to make, and the German guards.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
okay.
interesting.
I want to say something about that.
I don't want you guys to
Yes,
argue. Okay.
I agree. I agree with you, of course, Alex, that the Germans and the inmates can't be compared because even the highest placed inmate was, in a way, in the at the mercy of the Nazi guards or of the Nazi camp commanders. But I think it's important to understand, and the best of these memoirists. Again, I keep thinking about Primo Levi, who, like Debreczeni, you know, he was a young adult. Debreczeni was a little older. He was almost 40 by then. Primo Levi was in his 20s. But he, you know, he understood that that you can't make absolutely blanket statements totally, even about the inmates. Some inmates were calculating, you know, not very nice people.
Absolutely.
And you can't claim that everybody yes, everybody was a victim, of course, and they should never have been there. And you're right that hunger does awful things to people, but it's also true that, and your uncle points this out in the book, some people who were really had no careers or anything before, suddenly they became, you know, the block leader, and suddenly they became, hey, you know, like I'm powerful. They were nobody before. So he's aware. I think he's really interested in the possibilities of humanity and inhumanity in human beings, you know, and the way that even the way I think at one point he decides, maybe if I go to this guy who's not a bad guy, he's a record keeper, maybe if I give him my name, maybe if I tell him my name instead of my number, maybe then he will reassign me to a better work detail because he had a horrible work detail. So he goes to this guy and he gives him his name, and the other man tells him his name, and that's the beginning where he reassigns him to a better work detail. So it's this. It also was a survival mechanism for your uncle. That is, he understood.
Oh,
Maybe I can
he
actually.
understood human nature. He understood human nature, and he knew how to use it. But
Yeah.
the scene that you described was not with a German guard. It was with another
That was
prisoner.
with that. Well, yes, of course. I mean,
Right.
not every inmate was bad, as I pointed out.
Good,
But
good,
some
good.
of the inmates in charge, especially doctors, who saved his life twice in Dernhow. Once when he had diarrhea. The by then the camp doctor, chief doctor, had realized that he had this really eloquent man lying there, and they helped him. They fed him tons of horse fat or whatever to get him out of the diarrhea. He could have died. Most people who had diarrhea died, 95%. And the second time when he had typhus, spotted typhus, not the worst kind, and and he recovered, but it was thanks to inmates who were doctors and who really took care of him.
They were
So,
doctors
so
in
I'm
real
not
life, right? They
suggesting,
weren't not
yeah,
camp doctors, right? They were
yeah,
actual
I'm not.
doctors. Yeah.
They were
No,
actual
they
doctors.
were actual doctors who were prisoners.
Right,
Who,
right.
yeah,
That's
Yeah.
right. They
No,
were
it's yeah.
camp
Mhm.
doctors who were prisoners. That is to
Yeah.
say, they were there, but they were doctors. And
Yeah.
they had in Dernhow in the hospital camp, they had jobs, they had major jobs. They were pretty much at the top of the heap, because they were responsible for all these, well, whatever, for the deaths as well as the lives I mean, some of them were very good. So,
Well, this is
so,
this is a really
yeah,
yeah. This is a really fascinating exchange, and I want to just throw in two observations about it. First of all, it sounds, from what you said, Alex, just now, and really what you're both saying, it sounds as if the same qualities in Debreczeni that allowed him to analyze human nature in this way, that produced such a brilliant memoir, such a brilliant observation, um, might also have been some of the qualities that helped him survive. I mean, of course, he was
yes,
lucky, but that he somehow had this ability to evaluate not just his surroundings, but the
yes,
nature of the people around him.
yeah.
Uh,
You know, I mean, to be realistic, luck has a lot to do with it.
sure.
And, every survivor's story, there are many, many coincidences, many things that happen. If any one of those were different, he would not have been a survivor. So there is a lot of that. But you are right. His ability to analyze people and sometimes to use that to his advantage was very helpful. Incidentally, and he's very bitter about it, and he comes out very strongly, even against his fellow Jews, who are actually, in other ways, much better suited for survival. I'm speaking about like the Greek Jews who were laborers, port laborers, or they were loggers, or they weren't intellectuals. That scene that Susan, you described, that 26-year-old, he was a logger. And as Yoshi says, most Jews would not even recognize that he was Jewish because he didn't fit even our stereotype, intellectual and educated and this and that. So in some ways, and it's surprising because he was a very gentle and good man and a humanist. I think there was a rage that he was not better equipped. So
Mm,
in some ways, he was better equipped than maybe somebody who was not educated. And of course, the fact that he had been a journalist, he used that to ingratiate himself with with a capo. But in some ways, he was also very unfortunate that he was not a physical laborer. But of course, at the end, so much of it was luck, just luck.
Maybe this is an unfair question, Alex, but did he speak about these topics at all in the years that you knew him, aside from the book? Did you ever talk to him about it or about the
You
book?
know, I did speak, but not the sort of deep conversation I would have now. I think a lot has to do with that I was not, mature enough, and also because because while I did grow up in Belgrade, much of the time, my dad was a Yugoslavian diplomat, and we would rotate between Belgrade and foreign postings. I was twice
Yeah.
in Washington, once in Sao Paulo, once in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And during those times, and it wasn't like, we didn't have FaceTime and, all of
Right.
this good technology. So in those years, I was cut off from him.
I'm thinking more about him, though. I mean, I know that many survivors, especially once they've put their
No,
story
no,
down, they
no,
don't want to
no, no,
discuss
no.
it anymore.
He spoke and he was open, and hey, he wrote the book. He
Well,
wrote
yeah,
the
right. And
book
the
and
book
he
was
wrote
out in.
poems. He
Hmm.
wrote poems. He wrote newspaper articles. He was furious that there were former Nazis from Yugoslavia who
Hmm.
were openly living in Germany and Austria and Italy. He was furious with the Vatican for, facilitating the escape of major Nazi war criminals to South America. So no, he was open.
Wow, that's very interesting, especially, well, I want to segue into from that into politics a little bit, but before that, I can't resist noting, I mean, Alex, when you answered that question, when responded to that idea that somehow there might have been some good in some of the German guards, and that, I was reminded that there's so much um, sensitivity and controversy over the question of whether you can attribute any goodness to any of the people involved in that whole, in any of the in the camps. And there's
Yeah.
elsewhere in the issue of Moment that's just coming out, we have a piece about Viktor Frankl, and he was once actually hissed from a lectern, called a fascist sympathizing pig. He himself a survivor, because he had had an overseer that he considered a person who was doing his best, who he and other inmates had tried to shield. So I feel like emotions run very high on this, do they not? On this question?
Yeah, I think so. And Jozsi, by the way, devotes a part of a chapter to this whole issue of the Germans as a people who, on one hand, have contributed so much to human civilization in literature and the arts and science, many areas. On the other hand, they produced Auschwitz. There was intense anti-Semitism in the rest of Europe, but they didn't think of. In fact, Jozsi says, the Hungarian peasants sort of envisioned the gas chambers, but he never acted on it. Hitler acted on it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So, all right, let's turn actually, I think since we're deep in the sort of the ugliness right now, I wonder if one of you, I think, which of you has it in front of you? We identified a small excerpt that really captured it's the
Oh,
same
I think
excerpt,
I
Susan,
have that one.
that you
Yeah.
quoted in your review in the Washington Post. It captures both his style and the sort of extreme nature of the experience. And I thought I didn't want to do that at the outset, because after that there's really nowhere to go. But let's read this two-sentence excerpt, and then we'll turn to politics a little bit, which compared to this is
Okay,
light.
so this is Debreczeni in his hospital camp, lying in his bunk naked, with covered with a blanket, and many new people come every day. And here's what he writes. You can tell his style from this pretty well. Having a new neighbor isn't a surprise. So far, I've had to report 8 corpses in the mornings, which has meant, among other things, that I paused 8 nights pressed up against a cooling cadaver. You can get used to anything. close quarters of this sort have meant being there as every dying man soils himself in his final moments and sitting up a corpse to get extra food. So, he's not hard, he's not easy on himself either. He and the others sit up the corpse so that because the food is sort of thrown onto the bunk, like a piece of bread in the morning. So if the person who is distributing the food doesn't realize that there's a corpse, then there's an extra ration of bread, you know. But you can get used to anything. That sentence is really that sort of, oh, there he is. He's making a point about, yes, this is what this was like.
All right, I guess I should have put a trigger warning on the front end of that, but it is a Holocaust memorial program, so I apologize to anyone for whom that was a little much. I wanted to ask, let me step back and let's go a little abstract. One reason, as you indicate, Alex, that the book kind of got lost in the shuffle of history has to do with the Cold War, right? And it's partly because the memory of the Holocaust was handled so differently in the Soviet-controlled East and in the West. And one aspect of it you mentioned, you talk about how in the McCarthy period, no one would even consider translating or publishing a memoir that ended with the glorification of the Red Army. But there's more to it as well. Could you talk a little bit about that? First, Alex, and then Susan, because I know Susan's also a specialist on this.
Well, sure. I mean, it took a while for Holocaust literature of any type to reach the public in the West. And really, there was a reluctance to speak about it. In part, it was just, people, especially non-Jews, wanted to get on. The war was won. They wanted to get on with their lives. Many Jews, American Jews, they wanted to get on with their lives. And it really wasn't until probably the Nuremberg trials, Eichmann, the capture of Eichmann. And then, of course, there was Anne Frank. And I can tell you that my father and my uncle were not upset that Anne Frank, brought a story to the world. They were very pleased, but they were sorry that it was that story, because it is not a story of the Holocaust. It is not. It is, as they call it, it was a limonada. It was a lemonade. In other words, it was, yes, very powerful. It was sad and so on, but it was not Cold Crematorium.
Right.
And Jozsef wanted people to know what actually happened. He, and he would, quite honestly, he would be appalled by some of the works and the movies that are coming out now, where you have Gentile rescuers, who, that is the focus, because that was statistically almost non-existent. There were incredible people. They were shining, the righteous Gentiles were shining lights in a very dark universe. But that wasn't typical. Mm-hmm. And so I'm digressing a little bit. So you asked about the politics. So as books came out, my father, this was in 1950. I was born in 1951. So, I didn't really think about it. I didn't have the sophistication. I didn't have the financial, capability. I didn't have the connections to do what I did now. I and my sister financed the translating of the book. I set up a little competition among the highest ranking. I went back and I chose among people who had won prizes, like from Penn, for the best translations from Hungarian to English. And I chose 4 of them. I interviewed them by Zoom. The finalists, I met with him. And I worked with this person for a whole year, literally every sentence, how do we make this fresh? How do we make this, really comfortable to the Anglophone ear? And I realized that only if an American publisher could read it in English would they understand that this cold crematorium is a gem.
Right. No, I understand. Yeah.
And that is, so that's how it happened.
Right. Susan,
Yeah.
I want to take a step back. You're also among other things, an expert in sort of the politics of memory. Um, do you think there are still important differences in the shape of historical memory between East and West, between different countries, in the way it
Okay.
evolved?
Yeah, I think one thing to remember is that in Eastern Europe, once the Iron Curtain went down, which was around 1948 or thereabouts. So before 1948, uh, in places like Hungary, for example, there were some very significant Holocaust memoirs, mainly of forced labor service, but that was bad enough. I mean, if we want horror, we can find lots of horror in those memoirs that were published. But once the Iron Curtain went down, the narrative became this was an anti-fascist struggle. World War II was an anti-fascist struggle, and we're not going to talk about the persecution of the Jews as a special part of the anti-fascist struggle. It's just all part of the same soup, anti-fascist struggle. So between 19 roughly the early around 50 and 1970s, almost no Holocaust works were published in Hungary. I can tell you in Hungarian, and I'm doing some work on that right now. And then in the 70s, it became a little bit possible, but people really, it was tolerated, but not much discussed. The real difference came in 89 after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when, a floodgate opened and you have these huge numbers of historical studies and everything else, and old works were republished and so on. But Yugoslavia, actually, where Jozsef published his book, was slightly different because, Tito was not fell out with Stalin. So starting in the so that's why Debreczeni could publish his memoir in 1950 in Hungarian in Yugoslavia at a time when he could surely not have published that book in Budapest in 1950,
And
because
he
by
mentions
then it
Jews.
was
Yeah.
hardline Stalinism.
Yeah.
And it was, anti-fascist struggle. So Yugoslavia was a little bit different, not quite in step with the total Eastern European narrative. But to answer your question about today, I mean, I think after 89, the walls between Eastern memory, Western memory really could come down, but there's still a language barrier. I mean, the fact is that it's complicated. The fact is that works published, I mean, after all, Debreczeni's memoir was known. He was translated into Romanian and into Serbo-Croat, but nobody in the West reads Serbo-Croat. So Alex did a great service to readers everywhere by publishing the book in English, and now it's getting translated into all these languages. So now the question is, will it be adopted in courses? Will it have a life as a classic of Holocaust literature? And that I think we have to wait and see. But it's well on the way, I think, at
Yeah,
the moment.
yeah, I think the obvious comparison would be in classwork and things like that would be something like Elie Wiesel's Night, which also sort of goes into the darkest examples. But it is different in a lot of important ways from that, partly because it's an adult, not a teenager, not a child, and there are, as we've talked about. I don't want to go back over that, but Alex, just to follow up on this business about the languages. I glanced at the questions, which we'll turn to in a second, and there are a bunch of perfectly lovely comments pointing out, are you kidding? There are Jews they can't tell the Balkans, they couldn't place Yugoslavia in the East or the West. They have no idea about the Balkans, the Sephardim, that they even had a part in the Holocaust. This is completely new to most people. And so, not to be, I'm not trying to be insulting, but I'm just wondering if in your real or virtual travels with this book, what kind of a reaction have you been getting? And is that part of it? Are people just like completely baffled by where this fits, or?
Well, my lecture takes that into account. So, I walk through Jozsef's life, starting in Austria-Hungary in 1905, World War I, them having to flee to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, how he was during a short time in Hungary when Jews were welcomed back. It was only 6 years. He actually was recruited to go back to Budapest, had to flee again in 1938. Then, of course, came the attack on Yugoslavia, the Holocaust. So through his life, I portray what it was like for Jews in Europe. So my lectures, try to put things in a historical context.
Maybe we can link to something. I'll see if we'll see if there's some way we can connect up to the talks you're giving.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. People do ask, for example, what happened to my mother? What happened? How did they survive? For my mother, for example, was also at Auschwitz. She did not know my father before the war. Obviously, didn't know Jozsef. She too was deported during that massive deportation of Hungarian Jews. She went through selection at Auschwitz. She also went to a slave labor camp. And by the way, one of the things about the book, which is very interesting, is that Jozsef names of companies. One of the companies that makes tunnels is actually a company in Dortmund. They're still making tunnels, and you go on their website. There's nothing about World War II. There's nothing about slave labor. My mother also was in a totally different company. That company, it's coincidence, also headquartered in Dortmund. Again, you go to the website, nothing about World War II, nothing about slave labor.
Yes, well, this is why firsthand documents, firsthand witnesses are still they continue to be so important. I think we're gonna turn to questions in a second. Let me first thank you both for talking about this important and difficult material. It's always kind of a journey. I want to ask you one more question, Alex, and that is, how do you think your uncle would like to have been remembered?
I think the book is a warning to humankind. I think he wanted, and I know especially towards the end of his life, he seemed to be much more depressed, like the world had not learned anything. He had a full life after. He never married, but he was active professionally. He was a great uncle to me. But certainly in the latter years, I think he was very concerned about where the world was. And I think the book, not only the book, in his poems, I mean, he explicitly writes about it. He talks in one of the poems how his mother's killer has found a new uniform, and he stands, I'm paraphrasing, on her grave. And actually, I always tell people he was only partially correct. A lot of them didn't even need new uniforms. Most of the people, they got away scot-free. This is an incredible book by Tobias Buck. He's a German. And I think one of the reasons he wrote this book, just came out, is because he found out that one of his grandfathers was a Nazi.
Mm-hmm. So that's still going
And
on.
it turned out that virtually everybody's grandfather
Was a
was
Nazi.
a Nazi.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's amazing. It's, what I said about the SS guards were not coerced to being the guards of the concentration camps. You could leave without any penalty. The architects of the Wannsee Conference, there were 10 who survived World War II. 3 were executed, 2 by the Allies, 1 by Eichmann by Israel. 7 got away. They got really at most like a little slap on their hand.
Hmm.
So to go back, what would be his message is be afraid of fanatic ideologies. Fanaticism is what ends up with Auschwitz or something similar. And he writes about it. He said, I'm paraphrasing, he said, Napoleon's soldiers in their haversacks had marshal's batons. In other words, these officers aspired for higher, higher status, prestige, money, whatever. He said, Hitler's Philistines carried castrating knives.
Oh God, must we end on? Huh. In other words,
That's what he wanted. That's fanaticism. That
Wait.
is fanaticism.
Yeah. Go ahead, Susan.
I totally agree, and I think that is why, we spoke about this the other day when we were preparing for this. Debreczeni comes out of a line of writers. In other words, I think that we have to be aware. These are people who are steeped in European literature and ideas about humanity, and fanaticism goes against the grain of people who have a humanistic education. And incidentally, it's one reason why the humanities count and are important. And
Yes.
and why AI is not the only way to go. I think we have to read the classics. He knew the classics, and all the great memoirs of the Holocaust were steeped in a kind of humanistic culture that we shouldn't forget. So I totally agree with Alex that he would be very much opposed to fanaticism of any kind.
Okay, well, I won't suggest we would dare to end on an up note, but let us say eternal vigilance and humanistic insight. And thank you guys very much. And let's turn, I think there may be a few questions and we have a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all very much for that very informative, important conversation. Let me combine several questions to see if we can get to more of them. One question was, where was your family deported from? Were they from Sarajevo or Serbia? Somebody else wanted to know, where was your father while where did he go and how did they reunite? And then there was one other one here. A question about that you don't have the same last name, and I know you told us that story in prep.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
Yeah, so I'll just start with that. My Debreczeni is a nom de plume, a writer's name. My uncle was born Bruner. Where did they live? On April 6, 1941, Germany and its allies attacked Yugoslavia. All resistance was broken down within 2 weeks. And the fate of Jews depended very much on what part of Yugoslavia they were in. So my mother and Jozsef and all my 4 grandparents were in this area in northern Serbia called Vojvodina, or more specifically Bačka, and they were deported from there. I did have family in Sarajevo too. They too were deported, but mostly they were deported to in Croatia. That was under Croatian control. The people who in my family who survived, other than Jozsef and my mother, who survived the camps, were those who were able to join Tito's partisans, either immediately For example, some of the family in Sarajevo immediately joined the partisan movement in Sarajevo, which was the capital of today's Bosnia. My father and the third brother, the youngest, they were in Zagreb, and the anti-Semitism there was intense. The local population started shooting Jews even before the arrival of the German army. They basically walked, hitchhiked to get to the Italian zone, which was in Dalmatia. They were interned by the Italians on the island of Korčula, which ironically is one of the world's most beautiful islands. It is a stop on cruise ships tours now. They were always, they were protected by the Italians, even though the Italian commander was under constant pressure to hand over the Jews. When Mussolini fell in 1943, all the Jews who were interned in that zone joined the partisans, and that's how they survived.
How did they find their way back to each other?
Well, you mean my uncle and his brothers?
Yes.
Well, they all came back to Belgrade, the capital.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
The story the story is interesting because unlike a lot of the survivors were aware of, they didn't end up coming to the US or Israel. They stayed in Europe. So it's a different.
Yeah, so half of the Yugoslav Jews left for Israel in 1948. This was the one exception that Tito made for people to leave the people's paradise. Jews, they had to leave all their belongings. He was under the influence of a beloved Sephardic Jewish advisor, Moshe Piade, who, even though he was a staunch communist, got him to allow Jews who wanted to go to Israel to do so. Half of the remaining 14,000 that survived did. My parents and Jozsi did not.
Thank you. Somebody wanted to know if you could just say the name of the book you held up before by Thomas Buck, and I will include that in a follow-up email.
Final Verdict, Tobias Buck.
Yes, and I've put in the chat also a link to the book Cold Crematorium, and I put a link to Susan's book, Daughter of History. So you'll find that there, and we'll send that in a follow-up email. Someone wanted to know if there are other books waiting to be translated for those who speak English and read English to learn more about the stories, the Holocaust.
Well, I think that what's interesting is that a number of books that I had mentioned, which were published early, right after the war, at least in Hungarian, have been translated. Some of them quite recently. I mean, there's one called "The Smell of Humans" by Ernest Sape. "The Smell of Humans." That has now become a well-known book. Sape, like Debreczeni, was a writer. And wrote extremely well. And there's another one called "Nine Suitcases," which was translated already 20 years ago, 2004. I don't know too many like Debreczeni's book, which haven't been translated until today. There are some though that I think are getting translated just in the last 10 years. So, from Eastern Europe, and there must be more.
All right, well, thank you so much. Again, thank you, Alex and Susan and Amy, for this really important conversation. As I mentioned, we will send everything out in an email with all of the links. And we encourage everybody to go to momentmag.com to sign up for our upcoming programs. Thank you all for joining us today.